Hello, everybody, and welcome to the fourth EPB-APECS webinar in our series of webinars jointly organised by the European Polar Board and the Association of Polar Early Career Scientists. Today, we will be listening to Kristina Bear, who is the Communications Officer at the EU-PolarNet project based at the RV in Bremerhaven, who's going to talk about the EU Arctic Cluster. Before I hand over to Kristina, I'll just go through a few things. First of all, this webinar is being recorded at the moment, so you will be able to recap the lecture afterwards. Be available via the European Polar Board website, which is europeanpolarboard.org. And there's also previous webinars in this series available there as well, and information on future webinars as well. If you have any questions during the webinar, we can save those to the end, and you can either use the Zoom webinar system. There's a Q&A button at the bottom. If you click there, you can type your question there, and then I'll put those to Kristina at the end. Or otherwise, you are. I think there's a way you are able to indicate you want to speak, and then we can unmute you, and you can put your question to Kristina yourself. But I think it's usually easiest to use the typed questions box. Without further ado, I will pass over to Kristina. Kristina.
Thank you very much, Joseph, and thank you for everybody joining this. I'm very thankful that the EPB and APECS decided to have a webinar on the EU Arctic Cluster. So I hope you enjoy the presentations. If you have any questions, just please let us know. In the presentation or in this webinar, I'm going to start off with generally a couple of slides on why is the EU funding polar research at all. Then I'm going to give you an overview of who is the Arctic Cluster, who's in it, and then what are we doing in the cluster, what are joint activities. So I'm going to start off with why is the EU interested in Arctic research, and in to see how to get my slides further. This way. No, it's going to be a one-slide presentation. Here we go. Okay, so in April 2016, the European Commission and the High Representative published a so-called Integrated European Union Policy for the Arctic. And in it, the EU stated an interest to play a key role in the Arctic. And as you can see here, it listed 3 priority areas, which are climate change and safeguarding the Arctic environment, sustainable development in and around the Arctic, and international cooperation on Arctic issues. The EU also states in the document that it is very interested and attaches particular importance to research, science, and innovation linked to the Arctic, and as such also intends to remain a major contributor for Arctic research, so remain one of the largest funders for Arctic research. And the Horizon 2020 funding program is basically built upon this EU Arctic policy. So the 200 million euro that the EU is investing, the time frame 2014 to 2020, is more or less related to the aims that the European Union states in its Arctic policy. And on the right side, you can see the logos of the projects currently building the EU Arctic cluster and receiving funding, all except one from Horizon 2020. So it is more or less our task from the EU to help the EU to implement EU Arctic policy. Now, why is the EU so interested in the Arctic? Well, I don't need to tell you, but one of the phrases going around is what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. And of course, the EU is aware of that Arctic change does have impacts, global impacts, and of course, therefore, also impacts on Europe, on European weather and climate, and European society and economy. Also, mitigation and adaptation strategies that the EU sets up in the Arctic are part of the EU's efforts to combat climate change within the Paris Agreement and to implement the Paris Agreement. Same holds true for the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Actions that the EU takes in the Arctic counts towards its contributions to achieve the SDGs. And Arctic research is also meant to and able to help the EU to implement appropriate policies to tackle climate change and to enable sustainable development of the Arctic. On the right hand, you can see a quote from Andrea Tilche. He's the head of unit Climate Action and Earth Observation at the Director General Research and Innovation at the European Commission. And in our COP23 session, which I will speak about a bit later, he said, spending in Arctic research and observation is not a cost, but an investment that generates benefits. So I think as long as that is the EU's view on polar research, we are on a safe side. It means that money will keep coming and we'll be able to still do research because the EU sees it as an important part to implement their policies. Now the EU Arctic Cluster. It consists of 9 projects, 8 of which I said are funded through the Horizon 2020 program and 1 through the former funding program, which was Framework Program 7, that's ICE-ARC. Then we also have the affiliated partner, which is the European Polar Board. The idea of the EU Arctic Cluster was, you could say, born a bit more than a year ago at the Third General Assembly of EU-PolarNet, which was held at the Arctic Science Summit Week in Prague. And we invited the coordinators and project managers of those projects that were funded at that time, just to see how can we cooperate better, because the EU has an interest in seeing and that we are aware of what the others are doing and do things jointly where we are able to. So we were discussing, and one of our colleagues, Annette Skrepsta, came up with the idea, why don't we implement specific groups where we can tackle specific issues, which I'm going to show to you later, specific task groups. And we put all this under the framework of the so-called EU Arctic Cluster. As I said last year, not all of the projects were funded. So the EU Arctic Cluster is not something set in stone. It's something that changes as new projects get funded and might join the Arctic clusters, and old projects end their funding period. Ideally, we're able to sustain them, but that will probably not be the case with all the projects. So the EU Arctic Cluster will change over the time and be like a living network. The cluster covers a wide range of expertise. So they're really scientific projects looking into modeling, observation, forecasting, permafrost. There are infrastructure projects such as ARICE and INTACT, which give access to stations or icebreakers respectively. And there's a coordination and support action, EU-PolarNet, as Joseph said, that's a project that I am working for. And I want in the next couple of slides to give you a brief overview of these different projects. It's just going to be one slide per project, just to give you an idea of the diversity of expertise within the EU Arctic Cluster. So EU-PolarNet is a coordination and support action. It is at the moment coordinating the EU Arctic Cluster. And one of our biggest tasks, which we are currently working on, is setting up an integrated European polar research program. And we do that with our 22 partners, which represent most of the large European research institutions. And we are tasked by the Commission to set up this research program and also to keep the European Commission informed about developments related to the polar regions. So we give them advice wherever they ask for it, or where we feel we can give them advice. The special thing is the research program we are setting up is not a wish list of the 22 partners. We are really going out and cooperating both with other scientific institutions and organizations, but also with a wide range of so-called stakeholders. So we are engaging with business representatives, policymakers on an international and national level, and to a certain degree also with indigenous communities and local communities in the Arctic. So much for EU-PolarNet for the time being. Another member of the Arctic cluster is INTAROS, standing for Integrated Arctic Observation System. And that is exactly the task of INTAROS, is to set up and develop this integrated Arctic observing system, integrating data from the atmosphere, ocean, cryosphere, and terrestrial data. It is looking at existing systems, what are strengths and weaknesses, and filling in gaps in situ networks where they see there is a need to fill a gap. They have also been tasked to develop community-based observing systems and are working on a platform which will allow you to get access to data which actually comes from different databases. So you have one source where you can go when you're interested in different types of Arctic data. Then we have APECS. APECS focuses on the Arctic and looks at what implications does Arctic change have on weather and climate in the mid-latitudes in order to then improve predictions. It will develop tools to predict severe weather events. It also has a very strong educational and training component, and it works with users to be able to really provide services for weather and climate forecasts that are not just of scientific relevance, but actually are useful to the people who rely on good data. It's similar to what Blue Action is doing. Blue Action is also looking into improving the predictability of weather and climate of the Northern Hemisphere and to enhance modeling and predictive capabilities. For that, they firstly target lower latitude, oceanic and atmospheric drivers, regional Arctic change, and then in the second step also look at the impacts of Arctic change on the Northern Hemisphere climate and weather extremes for the Northern Hemisphere. Then we have NUNATARYUK. NUNATARYUK is looking at permafrost thaw in coastal regions and also subsea permafrost. And they are looking at co-developing adaptation and mitigation strategies for the Arctic coastal population. And they're really closely interacting with a wide range of stakeholders, Arctic stakeholders, to provide services that are useful to people affected by permafrost thaw. And their consortium is built up of both natural scientists and socioeconomic experts. ISARC is the one project which is not funded through Horizon 2020. Its funding period ended last December, but we are happy to say that it's still on board. So we are trying to keep ISARC within the cluster for as long as possible, although they don't have any funding anymore. The reason is that ISARC has a wide range of expertise and interesting results which are produced. It was looking at or assessing environmental, social, and economic impact of Arctic sea ice loss and did this in a really transdisciplinary manner. So the results, which are still being published, are very relevant for the other projects and for giving advice to the EU. So, as I said, we are very happy that ISARC is still part of the EU Arctic cluster. Then we have INTERACT. INTERACT is in its second funding period. It gives access to 82 terrestrial field bases in all Arctic countries and also in high alpine and forested areas. So in order to enable scientists to investigate and to understand the Arctic, they provide them with access to the field stations, which are not necessarily field stations that their own institutes or countries have in the Arctic. The same holds true for ARICE. It gives transnational access, not to stations, but to research icebreakers. ARICE, on one hand, looks at how can we better coordinate the existing research fleet, then giving access to these icebreakers in order to give scientists the possibility to conduct research in the ice-covered part of the Arctic Ocean, which you will understand is very hard to reach and to access if you're not on board of an icebreaker. And ARICE also collaborates with the maritime industry in order to see how can commercial vessels maybe provide a benefit for researchers and vice versa. Then we have ICUBE. ICUBE is our newest member, although it's not the one that's most recently funded. ICUBE is combining in situ and satellite data with modeling, and it is developing new integrated in situ observations and satellite data, and has a focus on short-lived air pollutants, so aerosol and contaminants, for examples, and also looks at providing indicators to stakeholders in order to provide services that are of societal use. And then we have, and I guess that goes without bigger introduction, the European Polar Board, which is closely linked to all of our projects and is, I guess, the one constant, because EU-PolarNet is not, European Polar Board is not a project that's funded to a specific time frame. So the European Polar Board will always be at the center of the EU Arctic cluster for as long as that exists. Okay, so that was a quick overview of the projects that build up the EU Arctic cluster. Now, what do they do? What is the EU Arctic cluster? The objective is really to create synergies between the projects. So to look at what different activities do all our projects have planned, how can we maximize their impact, and how can we also increase visibility of European polar research by doing something jointly. So it's not necessarily about creating new activities, but to see how can we better plan those activities we have, how can we make them bigger, because we are 2 or 3 or maybe all 9 projects working together on this. Also, the EU Arctic cluster does not get additional funds. So all the activities we do are funded through the money we already get from the European Commission. So it's about pooling resources, not just financial, but also human resources in order to upscale our individual efforts. We're also aiming at increasing knowledge sharing, because so often we're not aware of what the other EU projects are doing, not because we don't want to, just because there's so many other things on our plate, so it's hard to keep up to date on what the others are doing. So we're trying to establish a way of always having a constant exchange and to know how they're advancing, which deliverables, for example, have been published that could be relevant for another project, or where one project or more projects could support another project in a deliverable. And also, as with ISARC, we're trying to maintain the legacy of those projects those funding periods have ended. And then we do joint activities in 4 task groups. As I said earlier, during our EU-PolarNet General Assembly, where this idea was born, we discussed it would be useful to look at different areas where we work in, where we really can work together, because of course the projects have very specific objectives, but there are things that are similar. We face similar challenges. Sometimes we have similar audiences, the stakeholders. So we decided to set up 4 task groups in which we think we can work together. That's communication, stakeholder engagement, stakeholder management, data management, and very newly set up also education. So I'll give you an example what these groups have done or plan to do in the future. One of the first events, the first event, we really showed up jointly as EU-Arctic Cluster was the Arctic Circle Assembly last year in Reykjavik. There we had a booth. Those of you who attended the Arctic Circle might have seen us and stopped by and talked to us. So we had a backdrop and a flyer, created sort of a common visual language for the EU-Arctic Cluster. And we also had 2 breakout sessions, which were based on the EU-Arctic policy, taking up the 3 priority areas. The reason why we just had 2 breakout sessions is that the third one wasn't accepted. Otherwise, we would have covered all of the 3 EU-Arctic policy cornerstones. So we had a session on climate change, science, and safeguarding the Arctic environment, and one science as catalyst for international cooperation, where we also got the Commissioner for Maritime Affairs, Camino Vella, to give a video message. Unfortunately, we were not able to get him there in person, maybe next year. Then we also had a session at the UN Climate Conference, the COP23, which took place in Bonn. The session was called Polar Insights for Climate Action, Arctic Science Contributions to Implementing the Paris Agreement. And our ambition was to get together the different expertises our projects bring to the EU-Arctic Cluster and inform policymakers and other actors of the COP conference, inform them about Arctic change and all the different levels of Arctic change and what they mean and how this knowledge can be used in order to do better climate policies. So you can see a quite high-level panel up there. You can also see a quite empty room down there. So it was a bit disappointing. We had great experts, great presentations, and all of them really set to the target group and really being straight on for policymakers. But unfortunately, we were not able to reach that many policymakers. So we analyzed the reasons why that might have been the case. And if we go for another breakout session or side event at the COP24 in Poland, hopefully we'll get at least double the audience. Then we had the stakeholder management task group. Many things of the communication and stakeholder task group are overlapping, because going to a COP conference, of course, is also stakeholder engagement. So it's not just communication. So we often work together and do joint activities. But also in the stakeholder engagement, there is a lot of exchange on how do we, for example, avoid that all our projects reach out to the same stakeholders, ask them similar questions, and in the worst case, we're not aware of that another project just reach out to them. So we want to avoid that we reach a stakeholder fatigue and rather look at options. How can we work together where we have similar stakeholders? Can we do a joint outreach? And can we also build lasting relationships? So when one project ends, there is another project which can continue this relationship, because stakeholder engagement is nothing that's just built within the time frame of an EU-funded project. It's something that builds up slowly, and then hopefully as a relationship just grows, goes stronger, and lasts for over the time of a project. There's also an idea of sharing lessons learned. So if one did a stakeholder engagement activity and said this worked great, this maybe did not work so great, what can we jointly as a group learn from that? We don't all have to do the same mistake, but we might all have the same benefits of something that has worked. And things we're looking at now is maybe having another session at the COP24 event. Also, the Arctic Science Ministerial is coming up. We are looking at options. How can the cluster be present there? And you will also see us at the upcoming Polar 2018, which starts next week in Davos in Switzerland. And then I put data management and education down on one slide as emerging task groups. And data management was already in the beginning thought to be a good thing to focus our efforts on. And they will now start to work together. There was they needed a platform to actually meet in person, which they now had in May in Boulder at the Data Summit. So there they discussed how our next steps, how can we provide information on existing data and best practices and tools, how can we share our data management plans, and can we come up with technical guidance and aligned documentation so we can use each other's data and can also make it available to people, of course, outside of the cluster. And we had our first EU-Arctic cluster face-to-face meeting a couple of months ago in Brussels. And there we realized another important thing that many of our projects share is this educational and capacity building aspect of the projects. So we decided to set up a fourth task group, which is looking at joint education activities and synergies between existing activities. And on the picture below, that's from a summer school, Applicate Summer School in Abisko, also earlier this year. So that was basically it. That was a quick run through what the EU-Arctic cluster is and what we do. And I am very happy to take your questions or comments.
Thank you very much, Kristina, for that useful and interesting run through of the Arctic cluster. So now, if anybody has questions to ask Kristina, you can use the at the bottom of your screen. There's a button that says Q&A, and if you type them in there, and then I can put them to Kristina as they come through. We haven't got any just yet, but I will start off by asking a question myself. So, Kristina, is there, or do you think there will be an equivalent to the Arctic cluster for the Antarctic, or will the cluster, is there scope for it to be expanded to the Antarctic also?
So when we talked about the EU-Arctic cluster for the first time, and that was a big discussion point, should it be an Arctic cluster or should it be a polar cluster? And back then we decided most of our projects have an Arctic focus. There are some of them which are bipolar, looking at both Arctic and Antarctic. And originally we had beyond EPICA, the oldest ice core in the cluster as well, which is a designated Antarctic project. But for the time being, we realized we are strong on the Arctic side, and in order to implement it and get it working, we will try to focus on one polar region. That said, with the new calls of Horizon 2020 coming up and some basically calling for Antarctic projects, I think there will be a need to have something similar for the Antarctic as well, especially as the EU is very aware of Arctic issues. It does have an Arctic policy. It does not have an Antarctic policy, and I don't say that is needed, but there is a need to make policymakers and the European Union aware of that what happens in the Antarctic also is important for Europe. So I would think there will be an Antarctic cluster as soon as there are a couple of Antarctic projects.
Good, yeah, I think that's very much answers my question. Thank you. We've got a couple of questions come in just now. First one from Anik. Hello, Anik. Who asks about education, and is there any link foreseen to the existing Arctic Universities cluster? Which I presume she means the University of the Arctic. And that she understands that this is only universities from Arctic countries, but is there any link or potential link where the cluster can coordinate with University of the Arctic?
We have a very physical link, which is one of our cluster members, Kirsi, who also plays an important role in the EU Arctic. So we haven't really started with the educational task group yet. It was an idea that was raised and we want to work on it. But during the Brussels meeting where this idea came up, Kirsi already said, there is a lot of input from the EU, from the EU Arctic, which we can bring in here. So the EU Arctic will not be part of the cluster as such, because that is for EU-funded projects. Maybe there's a way like the European Polar Board to make EU Arctic an affiliated partner, but there will definitely be ways of sharing knowledge and maybe also do joint activities. I hope that answers the question.
Yes. So watch this space, I think, is the really the answer. There was nothing yet, but it definitely seems sensible to link up with University Arctic where possible. We have next question is from Lawrence, who asks, he says, it seems that the main audience for the cluster are EU policymakers, but are there any plans, or do you know of any plans for making information from the projects in the cluster more accessible to the general public in things such as education exhibits, documentary short films, or other similar things? Basically, is there anything happening with the cluster to help boost the dissemination of project information among the general public as well as policymakers?
Not yet, but it is on the to-do list, I would say. Maybe it's not the right phrase to use, but I use it anyway. The EU policy is a low-hanging fruit for the reason that they have a strong interest in that these projects cooperate, because then they can be more sure that the projects use the fund reasonably and don't duplicate things. So there is an interest from the European Commission to see this cluster working together, and they are our first audience because all of us report to them. But within for example, for the communication task group, we have looked at different events, also, for example, the European Maritime event, and looked at, is there something we can do to not just promote our individual results, but to raise the awareness of European polar research. And for example, the session at the COP23, and if we do one at COP24, was more that. It was more presenting the expertise European polar research brings in and how that can be used. We definitely want to be strong on the outreach component to various audiences, not just for policymakers. We just need to find a way how we can do it, and often the limiting factor, as it so often is financing and human resources. So during our Brussels meeting, we also discussed how can we improve this, and we are trying to find ways of improving this. So we're looking into it. We haven't been strong on that yet.
I hope that answers your question, Lawrence, for now at least. We have a third question come via the chat box this time, from Cesar, who says, thank you, Kristina, for the wonderful talk. And how is the EU Arctic cluster, what is its relationship with non-European countries?
I would say our relation to non-European countries is mostly brought in by the individual projects. So our different projects have partners which are from Asia, which are from Canada, USA, Russia. So the aspect of the international cooperation is momentarily brought in from the individual projects. So, for example, one of our Arctic Circle sessions was an international cooperation and how we can improve that. But it is nothing that we as a cluster are is an active part of what we're doing, improving international cooperation, international in the sense of outside of Europe. But it's something we constantly do anyway, because our projects do so.
Thank you, Kristina. I hope that answers your question, Cesar. At the moment, we don't have any more questions come through, but we'll keep the line open if anyone's got any more to ask. I would ask another one, and you mentioned how the cluster is a evolving thing as projects come online or get funded, and then their funding ends. And is there anything happening with the cluster to look back at previous projects that were funded maybe several years ago by the European Union, that maybe their results have kind of been lost a little bit, and it would be useful to use the cluster perhaps to rediscover the outcomes of those products, those projects. And is there anything the cluster is looking at in that regard?
Definitely, Joseph. I fully agree that there is a lot of knowledge that is there's a risk for that it's not used to the extent it could be, because when a project ends, there is not much more outreach and all that happening. We have looked into previously, so mostly projects funded through the Framework Program 7, so the same that ISAC was funded through and the previous ones, and reached out to a couple because the European Commission offers something which is called the Common Dissemination Booster, which is supposed to help a cluster of projects to disseminate their results, to engage with stakeholders. So they have different topics which they train a cluster of projects to better bring their results to the users, to the public. And within this framework, we reached out to some previously funded EU projects. And interest was, there was, oh, we see this would be nice and this would be great. Unfortunately, we don't have any financial and human resources to do this anymore. But then many of the projects that were funded previously have now people engaged in other projects which are funded at the moment. So I think there will be a way to integrate them, especially also as the European Commission itself reaches out to these projects now, saying that initiatives like the Common Dissemination Booster are also meant for projects which are not funded anymore. So it's a service which is free of charge, doesn't take too much time, but still would enable these projects to publish results, or to at least to publish results to bring them out to a wider audience. So in that specific framework, we have looked into integrating those projects. And I think if we manage to do that, these projects might also, in a more permanent way, maybe become part in one way or the other in the EU-Arctic cluster.
I think it's one of the most valuable aspects of the cluster is to help support projects to make sure nothing gets lost, as often happens.
Yeah.
So we at the moment don't have any additional questions. So unless any come through in the next few moments, I think we will wrap up. So thank you very much, Kristina, for your wonderful presentation. Very interesting and informative. as always. And thank you as well to APECS for co-organising this webinar and the rest of the webinar series jointly with the European Polar Board. As I mentioned at the start, this webinar has been recorded, so if you'd like to recap on it or any part of it, it will be available via the European Polar Board website, hopefully by the end of the week. And you will also, on the website, you can recap the previous webinars in this EPB-APECS series as well. Hopefully we will have another webinar coming up before too long. So stay tuned for that. And thank you everybody who joined. I'm Joseph Nolan from the European Polar Board, and thank you very much again to Kristina.
Thank you very much, Joseph, for hosting, and thank you for giving us the space to talk about the EU Arctic cluster. And thank you for everybody who attended.
I'll just also add that the website for the EU Arctic cluster is there on the screen, eu-arcticcluster.eu. So if you want any additional information, that's the place to go. And I think there's contact information there for the various projects as well. Thank you very much, everybody, and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.